The meeting room felt cold as Commander Zoltak paced in front of his warriors. Max the Corgi was now safely back in Greg's arms, but the damage was done. The Vexarians kept their distance, eyeing the small dog with what seemed like a mixture of disgust and caution. "We came here to judge if humans are worthy of the Vexarian Empire's alliance," Zoltak announced, his voice echoing in the large room. "Now I see you hide your true nature. You bring unknown creatures to our talks." "Commander, please." Susan stepped forward, hands raised in a calming gesture. "This is a misunderstanding. The dog is not a threat. It's a companion animal from Earth." "Companion?" Zoltak's yellow eyes narrowed. "You keep lesser beasts as companions." Greg nodded, scratching Max behind the ears. "Dogs have lived alongside humans for thousands of years. They're loyal and friendly." The Vexarians chittered among themselves in their clicking language. Susan couldn't understand the words, but their posture showed confusion. "Interesting," Zoltak finally said, "but it does not change that we must know your worth as potential allies. The Vexarian way is clear. Strength must be proven." Susan felt a cold feeling in her stomach. "What exactly are you suggesting, Commander?" "A challenge," Zoltak said, pointing to one of his warriors who stepped forward. This Vexarian was even larger than the others, with additional armor plates and scars across his exoskeleton. "Krasfold is our finest combat specialist. We propose a simple test. One champion from your kind against ours in ritual combat." "That's not how humans conduct diplomacy," Susan objected. "We prefer to negotiate with words, not violence." Zoltak made the clicking sound that might be laughter. "Words or wind. Action is truth. This is how all worthy species prove themselves to the Vexarian Empire." The human delegation huddled together, speaking in hushed voices. "We can't agree to this," Susan whispered. "It's barbaric." "But if we refuse, we might lose this chance at an alliance," said one of the diplomats. "The Vexarians control 3 key star systems near our planned expansion route," another added. "We need this relationship to work." While they debated, Greg looked at the Vexarian warrior Krasfall. The alien stood proud, mandibles clicking in what seemed like anticipation. Greg then looked down at Max, who wagged his tail, completely unaware of the tension in the room. "I'll do it," Greg suddenly said, stepping forward. Susan grabbed his arm. "Lieutenant, absolutely not." "We need this alliance, Captain," Greg said quietly. "And I'm the one who caused this problem by bringing Max on board. Let me fix it." Before Susan could stop him, Greg handed Max to another crew member and stepped toward the Vexarians. "I volunteer as Earth's champion," he announced. The Vexarians went silent. Then, as one, they erupted in their clicking laughter. Krasful stepped forward, towering over Greg by at least 2 feet. "This small one?" Zoltak asked, mandibles spread wide. "This is your champion." Greg stood straight, trying to look confident. "I am." Zoltak circled Greg, studying him. "No visible armor. Soft skin. Weak limbs. Are all humans so? Fragile?" "We're stronger than we look," Greg replied, although his voice wavered slightly. Zoltak made a dismissive gesture. "Very well. The challenge is accepted. You will face Krasfall in combat tomorrow at what you call noon. This gives you time to make peace with your existence." "What are the rules?" Susan demanded, stepping up beside Greg. "Simple," Zoltak answered. "The combat ends when one champion yields or can no longer fight. Death is not required, but it is permitted." The Vexarians turned to leave, but Zoltak stopped at the door. "One more thing. No weapons beyond what nature gave you. We will see what humans are truly made of." After the aliens left, Susan turned to Greg, her face flushed with anger and worry. "What were you thinking? You've just agreed to fight an alien twice your size with natural armor." Greg looked at Max, who had been returned to him and was now licking his hand. "I have an idea, Captain," he said quietly. but I'm going to need Max's help, and I'll need to speak with Dr. Johnson right away." Susan looked confused. "The xenobiologist? What for?" "I need to know everything he's learned about Vexarian biology," Greg replied, a small smile forming on his face, especially what kind of creatures they might never have encountered before. Night cycle had begun on the Harmony. Most of the crew were in their quarters, trying to rest despite the tension of tomorrow's challenge. But in Dr. Alan Johnson's lab, lights still burned bright. Greg sat on a stool, watching as the ship's xenobiologist studied data on his screens. Dr. Johnson was a tall, thin man with glasses and wild gray hair that stood up in all directions. Max the corgi lay at Greg's feet, sleeping peacefully. "This is fascinating," Dr. Johnson said, pointing to images of Vexarian anatomy. "Simply fascinating." Captain Susan paced behind them, arms crossed. "Skip the scientific excitement, Doctor. How does this help Lieutenant Martinez not get killed tomorrow?" Dr. Johnson adjusted his glasses. "Right, of course. Look at this." He pointed to a detailed scan of a Vexarian's sensory organs. The Vexarians evolved on a world very different from Earth. Their planet had no mammals. "No mammals at all?" Greg asked. "None," Dr. Johnson confirmed. Their world was dominated by insect-like and reptilian creatures, nothing with fur or warm blood like our mammals. "And that matters because," Susan prompted. "Because," Dr. Johnson said with growing excitement, "they have never evolved alongside creatures like dogs, cats, or any furry animals. Their entire biology and psychology developed without that experience." Greg looked down at Max. "That explains why they reacted so strongly when they saw him." Dr. Johnson nodded. "Exactly. To them, a creature like Max is completely alien. The fur, the way he moves, his behaviors, all unknown to their species." The door to the lab slid open, and Communications Officer Patricia Wong entered. She was a serious woman with long black hair tied in a neat bun. In her hand, she held a datapad. "Captain, I think I found something important," she said. "I've been studying the Vexarian language and cultural database they shared during initial contact." "What did you find?" Susan asked. Patricia handed her the pad. "They have myths about chaos creatures, beings they describe as having strange, moving outer layers and unpredictable movements. The descriptions sound a lot like how they might see a furry animal." Susan looked at the images on the pad. The Vexarian artwork showed creatures that, while alien, had elements that could be interpreted as fur. "And these chaos creatures," Susan said slowly, "what role do they play in Vexarian mythology?" "They're feared," Patricia explained. "They represent unpredictability and disorder, concepts the highly structured Vexarians find deeply disturbing." Greg stood up, excitement in his eyes. "That's it. That's how I can face Krasthul without fighting." He picked up Max, who yawned and licked his face. "Max is my secret weapon." Susan frowned. "You want to use their cultural fear against them. That seems underhanded." "Not against them," Greg clarified. "I'm not trying to harm or trick them. I'm showing them something new, something they've never encountered before. We're here to learn about each other, right?" Dr. Johnson nodded enthusiastically. "It's perfect. A cultural exchange instead of combat." Susan still looked uncertain. "And if it doesn't work? If they see it as a trick or an insult?" "Then I'll face Krasthul as agreed," Greg said simply. "But I think this could change everything. Show them humans don't solve problems with force alone." Susan sighed, then slowly nodded. "All right. But I want a backup plan. Patricia, have a shuttle ready for emergency evacuation, just in case." For the next few hours, Greg worked with Max, teaching him new tricks and commands. The small dog was smart and eager to please, quickly learning what Greg needed him to do. "You're a good boy," Greg said, rubbing Max's belly as the corgi rolled over on command. "Tomorrow, you might just save interspecies relations." As the others left to get some rest, Greg stayed with Max, practicing and preparing. He knew tomorrow would either be a diplomatic disaster or a breakthrough, and it all depended on a small orange and white corgi with a wagging tail. The Harmony's large cargo bay had been transformed overnight. The Vexarians had brought in strange metal objects and arranged them in a circle, creating what looked like an arena. The floor was covered with a material that resembled sand but sparkled with tiny blue crystals. Humans and Vexarians gathered around this makeshift combat ring. The atmosphere was tense. Captain Susan stood with her crew on one side, her face a mask of calm despite her worry. Across from them, Commander Zoltak and his officers watched with their yellow eyes, mandibles occasionally clicking in what might be anticipation. "Where is your champion?" Zoltak demanded, his voice booming across the cargo bay. "He'll be here," Susan answered, checking her watch. Greg was cutting it close. Had he lost his nerve? Just then, the doors slid open. Greg walked in wearing his standard Earth uniform. No armor, no weapons, nothing special. He looked small compared to the arena and tiny compared to the Vexarians. Whispers ran through the human crew. They had expected something more, some kind of plan or trick. But Greg looked completely ordinary. Zoltak made that clicking sound that might be laughter. "This is your final choice. This small one against Krasful." Krasful stepped into the arena from the other side. The Vexarian warrior towered over Greg, his exoskeleton gleaming under the lights. Though he carried no weapons as agreed, his natural armor and sharp claws looked deadly enough. "I am Earth's representative," Greg said, his voice steadied despite his racing heart. "Very well," Zoltak nodded. "The combat will continue until one yields or can no longer fight." Greg took his position at one end of the arena. He looked up at the observation deck where Susan stood with the other officers. She gave him a small nod, which he returned. The Vexarians began a low humming sound, a ritual before combat. Krasful stretched his long limbs, his mandibles opening and closing slowly. "Begin," Zoltak shouted. Krasful began to move toward Greg, his movements smooth and predatory. Greg stood his ground, not advancing or retreating. "I hear humans are slow," Krasful said, his voice deeper than Zoltak's. "I will try not to end this too quickly." Greg took a deep breath. "Before we start, there's something you should know about humans." "Save your words," Krasful hissed. "Actions speak truth. We don't fight alone," Greg continued as if he hadn't heard. Krasful paused, confused. "I see no other humans in this ring." Greg smiled. "That's because my ally isn't human." From his position, Zoltak raised his arm. "Enough talk. Unleash the beast." Greg's smile grew wider. "You mean this cute pup?" He whistled sharply, and a small door at the side of the arena opened. Max trotted out, tail wagging happily. The corgi's orange and white fur was brushed to a shine, and he wore a small blue bandana around his neck. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. The Vexarians nearest to that side of the arena jerked backward. Krasful froze in place, his yellow eyes fixed on Max. "What is this?" Zoltak demanded, standing up. "What creature enters the combat arena?" "This is Max," Greg said calmly. "He's a dog from Earth. A corgi, to be specific." Max looked around the arena curiously, then spotted Greg and trotted toward him, tail wagging even faster. The Vexarians watching made strange sounds, hissing and clicking rapidly. Krasful took several steps back, his claws raised in what looked like a defensive position. "Stay back," Krasful warned, his voice higher than before. "Keep that thing away." Greg knelt down as Max reached him, patting the dog's head. "He's completely harmless. He just wants to say hello." "It moves wrong," one Vexarian officer whispered loudly. "Its outer layer. It shifts independently." Susan watched from above, hardly believing what she was seeing. The mighty Vexarian warrior, who had looked ready to tear Greg apart moments ago, was now backing away from a small dog. "Is this some kind of trick?" Zoltak demanded. "Some human weapon." "No trick," Greg replied, standing up. "This is just a regular Earth animal, one of many species we live alongside every day." As if to emphasize the point, Max sat down obediently next to Greg and barked once, a happy, friendly sound. The bark echoed in the suddenly silent cargo bay. And then something remarkable happened. Krasthul, champion warrior of the Vexarian Empire, dropped into a defensive crouch and froze completely still. The cargo bay was completely silent. Humans and Vexarians alike watched in amazement as the mighty Krasthul remained frozen in his defensive stance, eyes fixed on Max. "What's happening?" Susan whispered to Dr. Johnson, who stood beside her at the observation deck. "Exactly what Greg hoped for," Johnson replied with a smile. A completely unexpected reaction. Down in the arena, Greg tried to keep his face serious, though he wanted to smile. Max sat obediently at his side, looking around with bright, curious eyes at all the strange new creatures. "Commander Zoltak," Greg called out, "is something wrong with your champion?" Zoltak's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation. "What is that chaos creature? How does it move with such unnatural fluidity?" Greg patted Max on the head. "This is just a dog. As I said, he's a common Earth animal. We've lived alongside dogs for thousands of years." "Impossible," hissed one of the Vexarian officers. "No sentient species could survive alongside such a cute little guy." Greg finished, scratching Max behind the ears. The corgi's tongue lolled out happily. Max, sensing it was time to play, suddenly stood up and made a playful bow, his front legs stretched forward, and his rear end up in the air with his tail wagging. The movement sent a visible wave of shock through the Vexarians. Several backed away from the edge of the arena. Krasthul moved even further back, his claws still raised defensively. Its outer layer shifts and moves independently of its body. A Vexarian scientist exclaimed, "Such a thing defies natural law." Greg realized they were talking about Max's fur. To the exoskeleton-covered Vexarians, the way a dog's fur moved and ruffled must seem completely alien. "Would you like to see what he can do?" Greg asked, keeping his voice friendly. Without waiting for an answer, he turned to Max. "Max, sit." The dog immediately sat, looking up at Greg expectantly. "Now, roll over." Max happily rolled onto his back, then back to his feet. Each command caused new reactions from the Vexarians. Some made notes on devices, while others simply stared in what seemed like horror or fascination. "You control this creature completely?" Zoltak asked, his voice lower than usual. "Not control," Greg corrected. "We work together. Max and I are friends." This concept seemed to confuse the Vexarians even more. Their chittering grew louder. "Shake," Greg said to Max, extending his hand. Max lifted his paw and placed it in Greg's palm. Greg shook it gently. "The chaos creature yields its natural weapons to the human," one Vexarian whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Greg looked up at Krasthul, who had not moved from his spot far across the arena. "I don't think your champion wants to continue this fight, Commander." "Does this mean Earth has proven its worth?" Before Zoltak could answer, Max barked again, this time a bit louder. The sound echoed in the cargo bay. The effect was dramatic. Krasthul dropped his fighting stance and backed against the wall of the arena. "I yield," the warrior declared, his voice shaking. "I yield to the human and his beast." Murmurs erupted among both humans and Vexarians. No one had expected this outcome. Up on the observation deck, Susan couldn't hold back a smile. "He did it," she whispered. "That crazy lieutenant actually did it." Zoltak rose to his full height, mandibles clicking slowly. For a moment, everyone feared he would be angry, declaring the contest invalid. Instead, he made a formal gesture with his arms. "The combat is concluded. The human champion is victorious. The human crew began to cheer, while the Vexarians continued to watch Max with caution and fascination. Greg knelt down next to Max, giving him a good rub and whispering, "Good boy. You just helped make history." Zoltak approached the edge of the arena, looking down at Greg and Max with new eyes. "Your species has hidden strengths, human. You command chaos creatures as allies. This is unexpected." Greg stood up, Max staying obediently at his heels. "There's a lot more about humans that might surprise you, Commander. We'd be happy to show you, if you're willing to learn." Zoltak studied them for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps we have much to learn from each other after all." 3 hours after the surprising end to the combat challenge, humans and Vexarians gathered in the Harmony's main conference room. The atmosphere was completely different from their first meeting, where there had been tension and distrust. Now there was curiosity. Captain Susan sat at the head of the long table, with Commander Zoltak beside her. Greg sat nearby with Max sleeping peacefully in his lap. Several Vexarian scientists stood at a careful distance, watching the corgi with a mixture of fascination and caution. "I believe we should restart our diplomatic discussions," Susan suggested, "perhaps with a better understanding of each other." Zoltak nodded, his movements more relaxed than before. "Yes, it seems we have misjudged your species, Captain Miller." One of the Vexarian scientists stepped forward slightly. "May I ask about the dog creature? How many such beasts do humans command?" Greg smiled. "We don't really command them. Dogs chose to live alongside humans thousands of years ago. It's a partnership that evolved over time. And there are more than just dogs," Dr. Johnson added. "Earth has cats, horses, birds, and many other animals that live with humans." The Vexarians chittered among themselves, clearly amazed by this information. "Show them," Susan said quietly to Greg. Greg nodded and took out a small device. He projected images onto the wall. Humans with various pets and working animals, a farmer with horses, a family with cats, people walking dogs in a park, a blind person with a guide dog. Each image caused new reactions from the Vexarians. They had never imagined a world where different species lived together in such harmony. "Your entire planet is like this?" Zoltak asked. "All these different creatures living together?" "Earth has millions of different animal species," Susan explained. "Humans have special relationships with some of them, like dogs. Others live in the wild. Our world is very diverse." A female Vexarian with scientific markings on her exoskeleton approached cautiously. "May I observe the dog more closely? For scientific purposes?" Greg nodded. "Of course, Max is very friendly. You can even pet him if you'd like." The scientist hesitated, then slowly extended a clawed hand toward Max. The corgi woke up, looked at the alien hand, and gave it a quick lick before Greg could stop him. The Vexarian jerked back, then froze. Everyone held their breath. After a moment, she looked at her hand, then back at Max. "It did not hurt," she said, sounding surprised. The sensation was unusual but not unpleasant. Slowly, other Vexarians began to approach. Max, always happy to meet new friends, wagged his tail and allowed them to cautiously touch his fur. "I never imagined," Zoltak said, watching his crew interact with the dog, "that we would find strength in such an unexpected form. Your species appears physically weak, yet you live alongside creatures that terrify even our bravest warriors." Susan smiled. "Different cultures see things differently, Commander. What's scary to one might be adorable to another." "Adorable." Zoltak tested the unfamiliar word. "Cute. Endearing. Something that brings joy rather than fear," Susan explained. Zoltak looked at Max, surrounded by curious Vexarians. "Perhaps, with time, we could learn to see through your eyes. And we could learn from your perspective too," Susan said. "That's what diplomatic relations are all about." For the next several hours, The meeting that had started as a tense confrontation turned into a true cultural exchange. The Vexarians shared information about their world, a harsh planet with dangerous predators, where their species evolved tough exoskeletons and strict social structures to survive. The humans explained Earth's diverse ecosystems and how humans had learned to live alongside animals rather than just fighting or fleeing from them. By the end of the day, plans were being made for future meetings, cultural exchanges, and even a possible Vexarian visit to Earth. As the meeting concluded, Zoltak approached Greg, who still held Max. "Lieutenant Martinez," the commander said formally, "your unconventional approach to our challenge has opened new possibilities. The Vexarian Empire values those who think differently. You have earned our respect." Greg smiled. "Thank you, Commander. Max deserves most of the credit, though." Zoltak looked at the small dog. "Indeed, the chaos creature, no, the dog, has taught us much. Perhaps there are many ways to be strong in this galaxy." 1 week had passed since the unusual combat challenge. The Harmony remained docked with the Vexarian ship, but the atmosphere between the two crews had completely transformed. In the Harmony's recreation room, Captain Susan watched as several Vexarian scientists sat on the floor, carefully interacting with Max and 2 other dogs that had been brought from the ship's science section. The aliens still moved cautiously around the animals, but their initial terror had faded into scientific curiosity. "I never expected this outcome," Susan said to Greg, who stood beside her. "When you first brought Max on board against regulations, I was ready to send you back to Earth on the next transport." Greg smiled. "Sometimes breaking the rules works out for the best, Captain." "Don't push your luck, Lieutenant," Susan said, but she was smiling too. Across the room, Dr. Johnson was explaining to the Vexarian scientists how dogs had evolved alongside humans, from wild wolves to loyal companions. The aliens recorded every word, occasionally asking questions that showed their growing understanding. "Captain Miller," a deep voice called from behind. Susan turned to see Commander Zoltak entering the room. Unlike their first meeting, the Vexarian commander's posture was relaxed, his movements less aggressive. "Commander, welcome," Susan greeted him. "How are the diplomatic discussions progressing?" "Very well," Zoltak replied. "My superiors are impressed with our reports. They have authorized a formal alliance between our peoples." Susan couldn't hide her surprise and delight. "That's wonderful news." "There is more," Zoltak continued. "They wish to send representatives to Earth to learn more about your world and its many creatures." He still hesitated slightly on the last word. "Earth would be honored to host them," Susan assured him. Zoltak's attention shifted to the Vexarians sitting with the dogs. "A week ago, I would have considered this scene impossible. My warriors, sitting peacefully with Cheos." He stopped himself. "With dogs." Greg whistled softly, and Max's ears perked up. The corgi looked over at his human, then trotted across the room to them, tail wagging. Zoltak watched the dog approach. Though he still tensed slightly, he didn't back away. "Would you like to try petting him, Commander?" Greg asked. Zoltak hesitated, then slowly knelt down. "I have been studying your relationship with these animals. As a military commander, I must understand all potential allies." Greg knelt beside him. "Max, sit." Max sat obediently, looking up at the large alien with friendly eyes. "Extend your hand slowly," Greg instructed. "Let him sniff you first." With remarkable courage for a Vexarian, Zoltak reached out one clawed hand. Max sniffed it curiously, then pushed his head against it, asking to be petted. "Now just gently move your hand over his fur," Greg said. Zoltak very carefully stroked Max's head. The corgi closed his eyes in contentment, leaning into the touch. "His outer covering is softer than I imagined," Zoltak observed, continuing to pet Max with growing confidence. "That's called fur," Greg explained. "Most mammals on Earth have it." Max suddenly licked Zoltak's hand. The commander flinched but didn't pull away. "What was that behavior?" he asked. "That's how dogs show affection," Greg explained. "It means he likes you." Zoltak made a sound that might have been the Vexarian equivalent of clearing his throat. "I find that I do not dislike this creature either." Susan smiled at this diplomatic understatement. "This is how alliances begin, Commander, with understanding and respect for our differences." Zoltak stood, his impressive height towering over the humans once more, but now it didn't seem threatening. "My species values strength above all else," he said thoughtfully. "But perhaps there are many kinds of strength. Your kind does not have natural armor or claws, yet you've thrived. You've made allies of creatures we would fear. You've traveled the stars despite your physical limitations." He made a formal gesture with his arms that Susan recognized as a sign of respect. "The Vexarian Empire welcomes Earth as equals," Zoltak declared. "Together, we will be stronger than either could be alone." As if understanding the importance of the moment, Max sat tall and gave a happy bark. This time, no one flinched. The stars shined brightly against the deep black of space as John Baker checked his ship's controls one more time. As commander of Earth's first deep space patrol, he felt the weight of humanity on his shoulders. 4 small ships moved in formation around him, their hulls gleaming under the distant sun's light. "All systems normal, Commander," said Lieutenant Kelly Morgan through the radio. Her voice was calm and steady, just like always. "Still nothing unusual on scanners." Baker smiled. "Keep your eyes open, Kelly. We're making history today, even if it's boring history." None of them expected what happened next. A flash of light appeared about 1,000 miles ahead of them. At first, it looked like a small star. Then it grew larger and larger until it filled their view screens. A massive ship, at least 20 times bigger than their entire fleet put together, had appeared from nowhere. "What in the world is that?" gasped Sergeant Peter Wright, the youngest member of the team. Baker tried to keep his voice steady. "Unknown vessel, this is Commander John Baker of the United Earth Defense Force. We come in peace and wish to establish communication." For nearly a minute, there was only silence. Baker repeated the message. Then, finally, their screens flickered and showed a strange face. It had gray-blue skin, 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern, and no visible nose. When it spoke, its mouth moved in an odd sideways motion. "This is Commander Kalik of the Vashani Imperium. Your species is unknown to us. Prepare to be scanned." Before Baker could respond, bright beams of light shot out from the alien ship, washing over their small fleet. Warning alarms blared across all their ships. "They're scanning our weapons systems," shouted Kelly. "Should we raise shields?" Baker hesitated. Defensive posture only. No aggressive moves. Aboard the Vashani ship, a young officer named Track watched the readings with growing concern. These primitive ships had nuclear-based weapons, outdated by Vashani standards, but still dangerous. When one of the human ships adjusted its position, Track panicked. "They're targeting us," he shouted, though this wasn't true. Commander Kellick turned. "Are you certain?" "Yes, sir," Track replied, his 4 eyes wide with fear. Kellick sighed. "Fire a warning shot. Low power." But Track, still panicking, set the weapon to full power and fired directly at the second ship in the human formation. In a flash of blinding light, Kelly Morgan's ship exploded. Baker watched in horror as his friend and her vessel disappeared into a cloud of debris. "Evasive maneuvers," Baker shouted, his hands shaking with anger and shock. "Return fire." The 3 remaining Earth ships scattered, firing their missiles at the massive alien vessel. The weapons seemed tiny against the giant ship, but 2 managed to hit, causing small explosions against its hull. Commander Kellick stared in shock at what Track had done. Ceasefire. That was not a warning shot. But it was too late. The humans, having seen one of their own destroyed without provocation, fought back with everything they had. Baker's ship managed to get close enough to the alien vessel to capture important data before being forced to retreat. As the human ships fled back toward Earth, Calic slammed his fist against his control panel. "You fool," he shouted at Track. "Do you realize what you've done?" This was supposed to be a peaceful contact. Back on Earth, emergency meetings were called. Baker delivered the terrible news about Kelly Morgan along with the data they had captured. Scientists immediately began studying the alien technology, while military leaders prepared for what would surely come next. Lisa Ward, Earth's best translator, worked day and night to understand the alien language from the brief communication. 3 days later, her face pale with worry, she entered the United Nations emergency session. "I've decoded their next transmission," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The Vashani Imperium has declared us a threat to galactic security. They're not coming to talk anymore." She looked around the room filled with world leaders. "They're coming to conquer us." In his quarters on the Vashani command ship, Commander Calic reviewed the initial reports on the human species. They seemed primitive, only just reaching space travel. Their weapons were based on simple nuclear fission. Their ships were small and fragile. "They will be easy to conquer," his second-in-command said confidently. Calic wasn't so sure. Something about the humans' quick response bothered him. They had adapted to the situation faster than expected. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "or perhaps we've just made our empire's biggest mistake."